I feel like every time we read such a long passage of John, we need to pray to listen to the word. Please pray with me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on this, your people, that the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. So I have a confession to make. I am really enjoying learning about the gospel according to John. It is different than any other gospel, including the ones that didn't make it into the Bible. To appreciate John, you have to know a bit about what he is dealing with and what he is trying to do. So first things first, John is not interested in historical accuracy. Even though the writer of John wrote the gospel about 60 years after the death of Jesus, it is clear that he is not following the story the way that the other gospels do. John is taking on a theological exercise. When we read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those are considered the synoptic gospels because they're similar in many ways. We get to see Jesus in pretty human terms. Aside from things like miracles, we can read those three gospels like a story, a narrative, a pseudo-biography. I say pseudo because how much of the synoptic gospels is historical is up for debate. But how much of John's gospel is historical is not up for debate. Because John isn't just telling the story that he read in those early manuscripts like Mark and other manuscripts that Matthew and Luke had access to, or whatever was floating around at the time. John cares about depicting Jesus in a very different way. Mark's gospel opens with John the Baptist. The first verse of Mark tells us that Mark's focus is on Jesus' ministry, and it goes like this. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, period. As it is written by the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, period. Right from the start, we are introduced to John the Baptist. So it is clear that Mark wants to draw a strong connection between the locust-eating baptizer and Jesus. He wants to show that there's continuity between their ministries and their efforts. In Matthew, we start with this: an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then, end quote, and then he launches into a list of begats. So-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, etc. It's clear how Matthew wants the readers to think of Jesus. His life is in direct lineage to the Jewish greats, specifically the passage we read today from Samuel, direct lineage to David. Then we get a well-developed story of his birth account. And right after that, he tells us about Herod dying, the family returning to Nazareth. And then Matthew introduces us right away to the raggedy-haired baptizer. And that's the connection. Luke sets off in his own way, kicking off his story in this way. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those from the very beginning who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. That's a long sentence, but he then launches into the story of bringing Elizabeth and Mary together, one carrying a baby that would become a desert-dwelling baptizer, and the other the Messiah. That brings us to John. Does anyone know how John's gospel opens? It's a wonderful opening. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him. Oh, he was in the beginning with God. All things that came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. That is how John begins his gospel. By a show of hands, how many of you would say that John is trying to give us a historical account of the life of Jesus? No. In the beginning was the Word, the beginning of all time, and that's not a human way of talking about historicity. John cares about the story, but he does not care about historicity. To read John as a historical text is to miss his message. The gospel, according to John, is a theological exercise with a purpose in mind. He doesn't open with Jesus' genealogy. He doesn't open with his birth story. He doesn't open with Jesus meeting the animal skin-wearing baptizer. If you're curious, in the Gospel of John, we do not meet John the Baptizer until the end of chapter 3. It's almost like just a footnote. And then when we meet him, Jesus and John the Baptist are baptizing at the same time, which doesn't appear in any other gospel. He opens instead by placing Jesus at the beginning of all beginnings, alongside God the Father, and even as a catalyst, the source, the life force of everything that exists. So if we're going to appreciate John's gospel, we have to approach it differently from the others. So far, so good? Okay. The community that John was writing for also looks very different from the communities of the other gospel writers and who they were addressing. In this story, we see the Jews pop up over and over again. The Jewish people pop up in the other gospels, but it's not in opposition to Jesus. In the other gospels, the communities hearing the stories are Jewish people. In those gospels, the conflict that Jesus deals with has more to do with power structures and religious leaders. But in John, the conflict has shifted to Jewish people and non-Jewish people. The antagonists in John's gospel, by and large, are the Jews. And unfortunately, John's gospel is the center, the root of what we know today as anti-Semitism, particularly Christian anti-Semitism. Something else that we see in John is how he approaches miracles and encounters. John refers to miracles as signs, not as miracles. And he expects the signs to point to the otherworldliness of Jesus. These things are signs pointing somewhere outside of who he is, who we see as a person. The signs also become opportunities for cryptic Jesus that we've run into a few times to show that he's also monologuing Jesus. Very different from the other gospels. The story that we read in the last couple of weeks really gives us some good examples of that. There's an encounter with a person, and then there's monologuing Jesus saying stuff in kind of confusing ways. Nicodemus is up a tree. By the way, Nicodemus was Jewish. And Jesus goes on and on about being born again and doing all these things. The woman at the well, Samaritan woman. And Jesus goes on and on about living water, that you'll never have to drink anything and you'll never thirst again. And today we have the healing of the blind man. John cares a whole lot about how you see Jesus and how you interpret the things that he does. He definitely cares how you interpret the things that Jesus says. So he creates monologuing Jesus and gives us lots of explanations why he says this, or why he says that, or why he did this, and because of fulfilling that. On the other hand, there's cryptic Jesus, but that's always in service of the reader understanding something essential about Jesus. And what John wants us to understand is essential about Jesus is that he is co-equal with God. This is a new approach in the gospel storytelling world. And I want to give a quick aside. It is okay, and I would say even respectful, to honor the parts of the Bible that are myth, story, poetry, allegory. The Bible is not one thing. It is complex and it is dynamic. Okay. So the people who were learning about Jesus through the synoptic gospels, those first three gospels, were part of Jewish communities, and they did not have a problem necessarily with Jesus being seen as the Messiah. This was part of the Jewish religious experience, their history and their narratives. Messiahs have come and gone among the people of Israel. But when we get to John, there is conflict at that time in history with the Jewish community. By that time, the stories of Jesus were being told in different ways. He is now being seen in proximity to God, not just in proximity to God, but as God's self. And the people promoting that theological move were not Jewish. In the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, God is named by 4 letters that we translate as Yahweh. YHWH. That's how Hebrew works, is consonants, and then they add vowels. So Yahweh is the name of God, and that is the name that apparently you should not speak. It is not allowed for the Jewish people to speak God's name. So anytime that the word Yahweh appears in the Old Testament, you're going to see it in a capital word, Lord. Instead of Yahweh, they've substituted Lord, so that they don't have to say Yahweh. So and this happened when Moses went up to the mountain and met God, and we talked about that a few weeks ago, where we also read that, God introduces God's self to Moses, and the meaning of Yahweh is I am, or my name is the root of all being. I am that I am. I'm just life itself. So here comes John's monologuing Jesus, and following that introduction that John gave us, putting Jesus at the very beginning of all things, we hear Jesus throughout John's gospel referring to himself as I am. Not only was Jesus in the beginning with God, but John drives the point home repeatedly as the only gospel with the I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, the door, the good shepherd, the resurrection and the life, the way and the truth and the life, and the true vine. 7 instances in John where Jesus describes himself as I am. The Jewish community would have taken note of these I am passages and would have felt that a line was crossed. That creates problems for John's community. And we see it highlighted over and over again with the ways the Jews regularly confront Jesus. The Jews are depicted as being unable to see. And again, that becomes clear how that has sown the seeds of anti-Semitism. So that's as far as I got on this sermon before we canceled church. Before receiving the news that Marty Reynolds died. I had planned to talk about the saga that the man in the story went through. Honestly, I don't like that passive voice, the saga he went through. It makes it seem like it was just something that happened. This man who was blind from birth must have had a very challenging life. He had to be seen as a burden to his family, as a waste of a good man who could be working, as someone who could not contribute in any real way. He may have been dismissed in other ways, the ways that we also today decide that someone who has a challenge must have other inherent challenges, especially cognitive ones. In other words, I imagine that they weren't any better than we are now in looking at a blind man and deciding that he was probably dumber and less capable than others simply because he could not see in the ways that other people see. This man's life was a saga of sorts. His story, however, is pretty much symbolic, like many of the stories and conversations in John's gospel. A man who cannot see now sees. The power of the gospel message is to make us see what we are unable to see, and we cannot do that unless we have the Spirit accompanying us. One glaring point of the story, I don't know, it's a long passage that we read, I don't know if you caught it, but one glaring point of the story is that he was subjected to all these challenges and interrogations by those who believed that they had a corner on God and understanding God, but who actually, as John tells us, can't see for themselves. Yet they put him through the ringer. And while I was going to get into talking about the man's experience with encountering Jesus, I did have the time to pause over the last week and a half. And pausing and picking up a sermon can be a blessing and a challenge. On the one hand, you have time to refine, what you want to say and understand what Scripture's saying to us. But on the other hand, life keeps pushing along and seems to be really good at derailing our best efforts sometimes. So I thought about those things, and it occurred to me to speak about this. How well this community understands being put through the ringer of questions and challenges by our greater community. People in this area seem to have little understanding about the vibrancy of the ministry that this community does. The cookie-cutter Christianity that they confess leaves no room for the unconventional people in our community. And that made me think of Marty. When I think about the different personalities in this community, something that we have to trust as a community is that regardless how different we are each ambassadors of God's good word. We are each representatives of what happens in this building and beyond its walls. And so I think of someone like Marty out there in this booming metropolis of Ladysmith, in his own way, representing a segment of how we are as a community. And I wonder what people in the community derived from that association. Have you ever considered what your membership to this church says about this community as a whole? Have you ever considered the trust that we place on each other to be fellow representatives, even spokespersons of how Christianity is lived and practiced in our church? Whether you are an avid motorcyclist who happened to be in Russia at one point in life meeting some prominent politicians, or a skilled plumber who didn't ask us to reconsider putting that spare bathroom in the basement of the parsonage instead of the main floor, which honestly, I didn't know how crazy of an endeavor that was going to be. But he did it anyway. Or the go-to friend who found creative ways to fix a thing. Or the partner whose loving devotion to his beloved included driving her to Comrath and sitting on that front pew, sometimes dozing. He was fully who he was, a Renaissance man with an insatiable curiosity and a willing spirit who never lost himself. I think about how excellent it is having had Marty as part of this greater community. And I think about what is said about him and what is said about us having a tie with him. I know this. The Old Testament today reminds us that when we are charged with doing the work of the kingdom, we have to test our vision. We have to adjust our perspective. Like when Samuel went in search of the king for the nation of Israel, and he was impressed by the sons of Jesse, impressed by the vision of what mortal eyes see. Yet it was David, the lowliest of the brothers, that God chose. Make no mistake, David proved to have serious flaws and be painfully human, and yet God worked in and through him. Flip that book 1,000 pages and you'll find the blind man. He was someone so imperfect to mortal eyes that he was dragged back and forth to answer questions. How could this be? God worked in and through him? To see as mortals see will always get in the way of our work. That's not to say that we don't have the capacity on our own to see with eyes of love. Of course we can see with eyes of love. That's what it means, I think, to be created in God's image, that we have that inherent capacity to see through eyes of love. But it is to say that the influence of the world can be overwhelming in telling us who is worthy to be a part of God's kingdom and to share the good news. When we see as mortals see, we can't help but focusing on who is put together enough, who is smart enough, who is successful enough, strong enough, good-looking enough, young enough, wealthy enough, powerful enough. That's as mortals see. There are many pressures to see as mortals see, especially these days. And when that's not the challenge, we still have to sift through life's demands and hardships. The gospel of Jesus gives us fresh eyes to see and a fountain that never runs dry. When we trust in God and when we trust in the teachings of Jesus, we are able to see with new eyes. We learn that our eyes can sustain love as its focus, with compassion as its fuel. In the face of questions, pressures, rejection, judgment, misrepresentation, and all kinds of other things that we experience in doing the good work of the kingdom, I want you to take this with you today. When we stop seeing as mortals see, we understand that our imperfect effort will always be more valuable than waiting for the perfect time. Our imperfect effort will always be more important than waiting for the perfect time. Your imperfect effort will always be more important, more significant, more life-giving, more love-affirming than waiting for the perfect time to move in the world with the love of Jesus. Amen.